Hello and welcome to the Let's Talk Azure podcast with your hosts, Sam Foote.
And Alan Armstrong.
If you're new here, we're a pair of Azure and Office 365 focused IT security professionals. Each episode, we talk about a specific topic in the space. This week, it's episode 20 of season 3. We're going to have a chat around Windows 365 and Azure Virtual Desktop and comparing each of the solutions and their features and benefits. Hey, Alan, how are you doing this week?
Hey Sam, I'm not doing too bad. How are you? Can't believe this is our 20th episode of the season.
Yeah, I'm doing good, thanks. And yeah, it is quite unbelievable to me that this is episode 20 of season 3. It's it it's quite interesting because I was looking through the episodes because going to talk about Windows 365 and AVD, and it's it seems crazy to me that AVD was episode 2 of this season, which is 18 episodes ago, right? So it's just it's every week and it's just part of the normal programming now, isn't it? So yeah, it just goes so fast, doesn't it?
Yeah, I can't believe it's well, like I say, I can't believe it's episode 20, let alone it's been 20 weeks since the beginning of the year, let alone
Yeah,
how many
exactly. Yeah.
episodes.
Yeah. Yeah, well I was thinking because it's it's my birthday coming up soonish, and it's sort of starting to become like the longest day of the year. And I was thinking, it feels like it's only just been the new year. Do you know what I mean? It's quite
Mm.
scary that it's like halfway through the year, nearly at this point. So yeah, time does fly. So Alan, we're going to talk about Windows 365 and Azure Virtual Desktop. I don't think we're going to dive too deeply into each of these technologies, right? We're going to sort of compare and contrast because they are very similar, aren't they? In what they do.
Yeah, exactly. And we've had those other I'll do a quick overview in a minute of them, but we've had the other episodes to sort of dive into them. So if anyone hasn't listened to them yet, Windows 365 was a couple of weeks ago on season 3, episode 18, and AVD, as you said, Sam, was beginning of the season. So season 3, episode 2. So check those out if you want a bit of a deeper dive into them.
Yeah, exactly. So Alan, yeah, let's start and jump right into it. So could you give us a high level, just quick overview of both technologies?
Yeah, sure. So um, Windows 365 and AVD are remote desktop services in effect. They allow you to connect to a remote to a machine in the cloud, where you can, where they're running Windows 10 or Windows 11, and they act like a machine, like a PC that you can do your day to day work on. Um, the main difference around them is that Azure Virtual Desktop (AVD) um, is deployed and configured in the Azure portal, and you in effect deploy the whole process, or if all the components in there. Windows 365 in effect is a cloud PC, acts like a desktop or a PC that you would normally have physically, and Microsoft manage the sort of back end, and we'll talk a bit more about the differences and stuff like that. But that's a very high level sort of overview of them. I guess they kind of are using an organization to provide access to services.
And are they very similar actual technology under the hood? Is that right?
Yep. So they are. Windows 365 is based on Azure Virtual Desktop management plane. So it's just really just around the actual infrastructure that's being deployed, and some of the other sort of, there's some extra features on the Windows 365 side to make it more integrated with into Windows 11, things like that, with other apps kind of thing.
Okay, yeah, so that's great. So you've got sort of a um they're both cloud hosted, but one is effectively more controlled by you or configurable by you. You know, is
Yeah.
there a some is there a trade off between simplicity and flexibility, if that makes sense, between the two solutions?
Yeah, so there is a difference between the two, yeah, because you got yeah, you're right. The AVD is more flexible, but they can become more complex, maybe more of an overhead on management, depending on how how you deploy it and things like that. And yeah, with the Windows 365, potentially there's quite there's less flexibility about what you can use it for. So that's kind of why this episode's sort of around not this one's better than the other kind of thing. It's more, well, this fits your scenario because they are, they're practically in effect the same thing. It just depends on what you're using it for,
Yeah,
really.
it's the same like area of technology, isn't it? And it's
Yeah.
maybe it's more applicable, in different scenarios. So I suppose that leads me quite nicely into this question: is you know, how do you choose which one to use? Is there a process that you would go through, that you'd work with somebody to identify what's right for them?
Yeah, so there's probably a few areas that you have to take into consideration. Um, I mean, one part is generally the technology itself. So is is remote desktop services the right thing for your scenario? Because that's a general thing. It might be it needs to be physical machines, potentially. Um, but some of the other areas are really around the cost, how you're using it. So kind of what I said, but within those two technologies, how you're going to use it, the applications that are running on on the end users cloud machines, um, and as well as like we kind of just talked about the operational overhead, whether you've got the skills, the capability to manage the infrastructure. If you got if you're in Azure already, and your your teams, your technical teams are able to manage virtual machines quite well. You got that process in place potentially.
Okay, so are we saying that some organizations may choose either technology based on their internal knowledge and skill set? Is that one sort of key? I assume that's a key part of it. If one's sort of easier to adopt, then you may think that would be easier for certain teams to manage.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So um, if we kind of go into that, I guess, then yes, the Windows Windows 365 is very um, simplistic on its deployment. It's all done via Intune. And we talked about this, a couple of episodes ago. But it's all done in Intune. As long as you just know how to manage sort of uh, configurations within Intune, so maybe just do a baseline policy for it. Um, in effect, all you do is assign a license to a user, and then the machine is provisioned for you, and then they can connect to it, and that's it. They're connected. Um, that's the simplest thing. You would want to add some more security on top of it, policies, things like that. But at a high level, to get a box there, it's almost that, just adding a license, applying a couple of policies, and then it provisions. Um, from an Azure Virtual Desktop side of things, um, you have to sort of know Azure quite well, per se, especially managing virtual machines. The Azure Virtual Desktop side of it isn't, I would say, too complicated. It's a little bit complicated, isn't it, Sam? But generally, it's not too bad to get an AVD environment up. It's whether to then managing it, and the after management of it is a bit more complex.
Yeah, because once you've got all of the AVD specific resources up and running, like your host pools, application groups, applications, they're like one time configurations, aren't they?
Mm.
If you did, okay, yes, that could be overwhelming if you don't know that technology. I can, you know, completely agree with that. There is a learning curve there. You need to understand how to configure it. But then I feel like, to me, the complexity is more in um, the management of the virtual machine. You know, things
Patch
like
management, things like that.
yeah, patch management, log log ingestion. Those were the complex things to you know um, you know streaming logs up into log analytics was it wasn't hard, but it was to get a more simplistic AVD environment set up, is relatively simple. It's all the things around it, and I suppose that is what Windows 365 takes away from you, right? But I suppose you still need to do that, wouldn't you? Because you'd
S-
still need to. you'd still need to stream your logs, wouldn't you? So I suppose that argument between the two
Well,
is mute, isn't it?
no, you probably wouldn't because you're not worried about the service. The reason why we'd only stream the logs would be for the AVD service, wouldn't it? To see, make sure that things are not breaking, and we're seeing those errors, things like that. With a
I
PC,
suppose
you wouldn't.
we don't care
We,
about the performance counters, do we? I suppose, and okay, yeah. Yeah, okay. So yeah, so it's the ongoing patching, and I think as well um like the right sizing the environment, picking the
yeah,
SKUs, and all of that's kind of specialist virtual machine knowledge that you need, you know. Um that's all picked for you, isn't it? Right? You just press a button and you get a box.
yes and no at the same time, because you've got to, and this is why it's sort of here or there with it, is that you've got to choose your SKU for Windows 365, and if you choose incorrectly, it's not the end of the world. But if you've signed up to a year's subscription for that SKU, then you've got to keep it for a year, or you've got to pass it to somebody else, and then that other user then got to have a larger SKU or lower SKU, whichever way you want to work with it. That's probably the only the difference around AVD, is that is changed instantly because of how it's costed.
Yeah, I suppose that would only that would become less of an issue in a larger sort of environment, wouldn't it? I suppose, if you've potentially got a large pool of licenses and things like that. But then again, you'd want to keep it quite efficient in terms of you
Hmm.
wouldn't want you don't need spare capacity lying around with that because it's like a licensing. It's just like a buy another license. It's not like a we need to be able to spin a box up or something like that. So you probably won't do that. Yeah.
Yeah, it depends on, and we're kind of going to cost now. So let's just talk about that quickly. That AVD is based on Azure consumption, so you only pay for when it's powered on, and you pay for storage of the disk itself, which isn't huge amounts. Um, and Windows 365 is a subscription based. So you buy a SKU level, four virtual CPUs, 8 gig of RAM, and 256 gigabytes of data, storage, and you pay monthly for it. Um, and they both work. There's probably a tipping point when maybe an AVD doesn't make sense from a cost perspective. That you have to flip it over to, in effect, a Windows 365, because with the Windows 365, you're in effect paying for it to be running 24/7. Where with AVD, if you're not using it, or it's not used as often, infrequent, then you can pay for just your usage, which then becomes a cost saving. Um, but of course, you've got to think about the overhead, cost overhead on that of actually managing it. Um, but with Windows 365, it's also worth considering that if you go into, and it's not a bad thing, but if you're going into an EA agreement or something to get discounts and things like that, and you want to add the SKUs in there, you've got to do that sort of validation of your usage of it, because you might decide to buy one SKU type and realize it doesn't fit. That's not the end of the world, don't get me wrong, but you've got to then use them. If I remember, it's every year you have to change. I think you can only true up. I don't know if I remember. I don't think you can true down. I might be wrong on that because I've never really dealt with an EA directly, an EA agreement process. So, um, but yeah, you have to choose, what it is, and if you need another SKU, potentially you won't get that discount because you've chosen a different SKU to add to the EA agreement, sort of thing. If there is a discount, it depends on that contractual agreement that you go through or process.
Yeah, I suppose it depends, the types of users that you've got as well in your organization, right? If all your personas are like the same or very similar,
Hmm.
let's say in your organization you've got mostly, you know, Outlook, Teams, web browser, right? Let's say everybody usually gets a 4 core with 8 gig of RAM, as an example.
Yeah.
Then in those scenarios, Windows 365 is potentially really simple to, you know,
Mm,
to to align with, if that makes sense, right? Um, but I suppose if this is um, if these environments are maybe something separate for people that have laptops anyway, maybe you're not using it to replace an actual, well, no, yeah, replace a
physical,
machine
yeah.
for a user, a physical machine for a user. Maybe it's like a privileged access workstation, or it's a another remote environment, or a jump box, or whatever it is, or development environment maybe. um
Hmm.
those scenarios can be more complicated to work out. Well, for both sides, I would then say, if that makes sense. I suppose
Yeah.
it's right to say that AVD, you can split your resources however you see fit, can't you? You
Hmm.
could say, I want this host pool to be this type of virtual machine with this, and split up to this many people. I want, this host pool to be a completely different type of, like, maybe this is a GPU host pool. Maybe this is a, you know, um, general usage host pool. Maybe this host pool, it's 8 people to a box, because they're light users, and all of those different scenarios. Um, so that there is potential for there to be cost savings on the AVD side. Um, but I think, as you've mentioned, you maybe trade that with operation overhead. Because um, the way I kind of see it is, if you're already managing a VDI environment, and let's say you're some sort of, like, you're a Citrix or something like that, at the moment, then AVD is going to feel quite a home to you, isn't it? Of
Yeah.
slicing those boxes up and sharing it and all of that sort of stuff, right?
Yeah, exactly. And again, AVD doesn't have to be multi-session. It can be, pooled, single one-to-one machines, or, you know, dedicated personal one machines as well. So it can act like Windows 365, absolutely. It's just whether it makes sense to or not, kind of thing. Um,
Yeah, because if you were doing that, would the argument be, if you just wanted one to one boxes, where would the argument skew to AVD? Would it just be about, mainly about usage? Like, if it was only used, like, a couple of hours a week or a day a week or something
y-
like that?
yeah, so if you had personal one-to-one machines that was, mapped to each user, then it might be that they don't use it that often. Maybe they do only work 2 days a week or something like that. That you've got to then, you only got to look after it for that amount of time, and it's only powered on for when they're using it. Um, I know that you do have that sort of the frontline license now coming into Windows 365, but that might not make sense because they might all, your whole team might work all the same day, sort of thing, the same days. Um, yeah, you got that scenario, but it might be that the pooled version, where you've got 10 machines, 15 machines available to people, that they don't keep the, they don't, they're non-persistent ones. They, they go onto whichever box is available, sort of thing. Um, that might be useful because you can just power them up when you need them. So you might have a pool of 20 machines that are one to one, but only maybe on one day 15 are running, and maybe another day there's only two. That's a quite a big, potentially a quite big saving from that scenario compared to Windows 365. But like you said, you've still got that potential complex or overhead of managing it as well. So it is quite complex to think about which way. And I think it's always, when going into it, it's always looking at both sides and wondering when that tipping point is. Um,
Yeah, and I suppose it can be quite hard for organizations to even make that decision, because if you've never used either solution,
mm,
then Windows 365 is going to probably seem quite attractive because of the lower barrier to entry,
yeah.
if that makes sense. So I suppose it must be quite hard to navigate that decision process.
I mean, Windows 365, there's a couple of SKUs there, but for small business with small IT teams, perfect, absolutely perfect. It's been, you got an IT company looking after your environment, because that generally happens with small businesses. They're able to provision them for you. They don't need to know. They don't have to be AVD experts or Azure experts at that point, and they can just spin you up some machines for you to use.
Yeah, because it's just endpoint management at that point, isn't it?
Yeah,
It doesn't matter if it's
yeah,
in the cloud or a laptop at that point. It's
no,
effectively the same thing. Yeah,
and it is that simple for bigger enterprises. It's not to say that it's just designed for small business. It's just the scale at that point, the cost of the scale of that large sort of environment. You've probably already got teams that do Azure, or you've already got teams that are doing high, device management, or like you said, you might already have an RDS environment with another with like Citrix, like you said, or on premise RDS.
yeah,
You might have most of those skills to be able to do it. And to be fair, there's no reason why on large organizations, whilst making the decision about which way to go, that you start with AVD. And I say that because you can decide on the sizes of the machines without committing to a month, 3 months, a year, and getting it not potentially getting it wrong, but not being efficient with it, with your choice. At least then you can try it out, because you can spin up a doing a one-to-one is probably the easiest part of AVD, of a configuration. It's the multi sessions that are a bit more complex, that you could easily get a machine up and running and try it out.
yeah. Or you could create a Windows 365 box and check out its CPU that it's got to see what SKU that you maybe want to go to, if that makes sense.
And that,
Not
yes,
that I've
I
done
think
that at all,
I,
right?
th- I think we chose right, didn't we, when we were doing our AVD projects?
Both well, no, from the the little investigation I've done of my Windows 365 environment, um we completely nailed the exact both were AMD, and I think we had the exact, I'm not sure it was the exact, I think they might be using slightly different boxes, but it was like the same family of chips basically, so we were pretty yeah, we were pretty close. That's for sure. And just talking about costs, if you are looking at AVD, just make sure you're looking at memory optimized instances. That's quite important for when you're deciding that, because that can make a
For
big difference for,
multi-session, yeah.
yeah, for multi-session. Yeah, yeah. And actually, in fairness, actually, even not multi-session, really, if you think about it as well, because
Hmm.
the CPU requirements of a user, um, you know from what I've seen and our usage of it, it's always memory, it seems like almost memory pressure, if that makes sense, and more than it is CPU. But yeah. But we've got AVD costs. So AVD on top of Azure is, do we have to pay for that, like the AVD service, if that makes sense? Is there a cost there?
It's included in your Windows 365 E5 or Windows 365 E3 E5 subscription that you probably have with your Microsoft 365 E3, or or you can pay per user per month with
Okay.
it. But generally, most users are going to be licensed for it, because they're using, because they're going to have their current desktops, things like that, in a large organization. So it's generally paid for or included, sort of thing at that point.
How does it then work if you like doubling up on that license? Like if you had a laptop as well, do you, because it's per user, does it matter that it's
No,
in two places?
not from a Windows 365 E3 subscription. I think you can have up to 5 machines.
Okay, right. And even Windows machines.
Windows machines with that, yeah,
Yeah.
that's Windows
Okay. Yeah.
machines, yeah,
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
yeah,
Cool.
and then
Yeah.
then you got your Intune. So,
Okay. But in
but yeah,
theory, you're only really using like one thing at a time, aren't you? I
yeah,
suppose if you're using it full screen, right? So yeah. So that was going to lead me on to my next question. What on top of, so AVDs? So Windows 365 is like a all in one. AVD seems to me like, as long as you've got the Windows license, you just pay for the Azure compute on top of that resources. Um, what about other costs on top of that? License costs and things like that. I think you just mentioned Windows
yeah.
365.
So you still got to manage the devices. So you're probably going to be using Intune, hopefully, to manage them, or Config Manager, or could go down
Don't make
group
that face,
policy.
Alan. You just said
Yeah,
config manager for everybody listening.
cloud, cloud,
I can
cloud
see Alan
burst,
on the
cloud burst.
webcam. You can't see him, but
um,
sorry to all the config manager
no,
experts in the
I,
audience.
I've used Config Manager. It's fine. But yeah, Config Manager or other tooling, you're going to need to buy that to still manage them. Um, so yeah, and then that doesn't matter where it's AVD or Windows 365 because they're in effect Windows 10, Windows 11, so you can manage them in it as an endpoint. So it's completely different to a sort of the old, not old, but the RDS servers being Windows Server and having to work out how you manage them and how you manage user interface and stuff like that. So
That more traditional approach, right?
yeah,
That's been done for a long time. Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. So there's that. If you want to secure access to AVD or Windows 65, you're probably going to need Azure AD Premium Plan 1 at least, so you can do conditional access. If you don't have that, then you can just use the security defaults to enforce MFA every time. The other things on there is for both of them, at least from the Windows 365 Enterprise onwards, you do need that Windows 365 license to use it. So you do have to have, in effect, a M365 E3 really to run it. And of course, if you want to use Office and everything else, you've still got to buy. The users have got to be subscribed to it all. So you can't really. You can use AVD or Windows 365 without it, but you'd have to buy a Windows E3 license for them to use it, and then they wouldn't be able to use Office or anything. Which is okay. You might have a scenario for that. You might have a contractor that needs to connect to a different application for it. But some of the other costs as well is potentially networking from Windows 365. So Windows 365, you can connect it. You can have it the network Microsoft managed, so it's just going out to the internet, so no connection. But if you want it to connect to your corporate network and access your internal resources, or it needs to connect to Active Directory because you've gone down the hybrid join route, then it needs to connect to a VNet in Azure. And of course, AVD connects to a VNet in Azure. So it's the same cost at that point for that part of it between them. But it's just worth considering that. I guess it's kind of understanding that actually there's a lot of crossover on some of these additional stuff you need. Some of it you probably already have, but it's just it's worth considering between the two.
Yeah, so neither of them are from a software perspective a one and done like single payment. You've still got all of the administration of the machine itself. You know, um, so think about it from my perspective. Think about them like endpoints that you still got to manage, right?
Hmm.
So yeah, okay, that's good to know. Um, so should we talk about um, how they're used and how you interact with, are they functionally the same from a user experience perspective?
So there are some differences. So the Windows 365 side is in effect you go full desktop with, and uh, you can use the remote desktop app or the Windows 365 app that's from the store. With Windows 365, you're able to restart it from that app. Maybe try and do some troubleshooting that Microsoft will try and do in the background. But generally, that's probably kind of it from the interface. And with the remote desktop app, it's in effect it turns up as one of the machines in there that you can connect to. Now with AVD, you can have that same experience. You can jump to a multi-session box where you've got multiple users on, doing standard or the same similar um, day-to-day running of operations, I guess, or what their day-to-day jobs on them. You can have a different scenario where you have, like I talked about before, you can have a one-to-one personal machine, a pool of machines. But also you can do something called remote app, which in effect is bringing, instead of you going to a full desktop like those other 3 or 4 scenarios we just talked about, you can just bring the application to the user's like view. So if they're just using Outlook, you can just, as a button on there for Outlook, they double click it, it launches the remote desktop session, but only displays them or presents them Outlook, and it just looks like it's on the machine. So if they're doing the other work locally, and they can just go to Outlook, which is then their business. Same thing for any other application. So you could have Word on there, Excel potentially could be the remote the RDP app to then RDP into your infrastructure if you're using it as like a privileged access workstation. Um, so there's definitely more flexibility there about how you represent or present your applications before. And I think, like we said, AVD is very similar to on-premise, standard, traditional RDS, as well as Citrix, because Citrix has that. I can't remember what it's called now, but in effect, the remote app capability. I think they've always had that, so you can just sit in a browser and you just open up your Office. You don't have to worry about the user having to go full desktop kind of thing.
Yeah, so there is a, if you do just want to share singular applications with users, I suppose AVD is your only, the only thing that will give you that flexibility to do that, right? So if you are replacing an environment, that you've currently got with that sort of functionality, that's the way to go. Um, but I suppose, from my perspective, the user experience of connecting to both is very similar, isn't it?
Correct.
It
Yeah.
might be, you might approach it in a slightly different app, um, but but the experience is near on identical, isn't it?
Yeah. It's definitely the same. There are some slight differences with Windows 365 because Microsoft's bringing out some apps to use it with, and different scenarios like the Windows 365 Switch app, which isn't out yet, which allows you to, in effect, because with Windows 10, Windows 11, you can have multiple desktops. In effect, one of those desktops can be your remote one. So it kind of makes it a bit more seamless when using it from a personal machine, etc., or potentially from your own, your own corporate machine. Um, but yeah, apart from that sort of those parts, it's the technology and the experience of getting onto it is the same.
Okay. So we've sort of talked about the boxes themselves and how users connect to it. What sort of applications can run on these environments? Is there a difference between the two? And do I have to think about my applications, on either?
So if you're going for your one-to-one sort of scenarios, then it acts like a PC, a desktop. So you haven't got to worry too much. And when they're especially with AVD, when they're persistent to that user, then it acts exactly the same way as a desktop PC. So all application will run on it, and it's exactly the same. It just becomes when thinking about multi-session or non-persistent VDIs, that's when you need to consider about the applications, because some applications might not be happy with running in a multi-session environment. They might only be able to run one of them at one time. You also need to check your licensing with that application, see if it's allowed to be run multiple times on a machine. You might have a per machine license, and having 10 people on there might be might invalidate the your license agreement with that software. Um, and there may be other things where some applications don't make sense to be in a multi-session host. Potentially you could say full on, say full on, but advanced developers, they're using large IDEs to build software. May have to have certain piece of software installed, but you might have different users requiring different versions, things like that. So then that's very difficult to manage on a multi-session device, sort of thing.
Yeah, just thinking about like licensing as well, because there is some software is can detect the operating system it's on, and it's potentially different licensing. Is AVD utilizing Windows Server, or is this just straight up like Windows 11, Windows 10 multi-session?
Correct. Yeah, it's Windows 10, Windows 11, and then yeah, Windows 10 and Windows 11 multi-session. So yeah,
Yes.
there are proper endpoints. I say proper endpoints, you know, proper end user endpoints rather
Endpoints, yeah.
than server based. So yeah, you're right. Sometimes they do that validation check and go, oh no, I can't run on a Windows server. So that's it. It's gone. It's out of the water sort of thing. Um, that's what the great thing is about the multi-session side of it is. It is just Windows 10. I say just, but Windows 10, Windows 11. So the user experience is the same. It's more user friendly than maybe
Yeah, and
Windows Server is.
I think when you use the word just, then it's the simplicity of that environment. It's not like these users are actually interacting with a server operating system. It should feel, natural to them,
Yeah,
like their endpoints that they're used to at the moment.
yeah, definitely.
And okay, so I think we've spoken about it, as we've gone through, but I suppose operational overhead. What is the differences between both sides?
Yeah, so as we kind of mentioned before, Windows 365, you're in effect paying for Microsoft to look after the infrastructure side of it. So the hosts, the networking, if you're not going to go via your own networking, they manage its uptime, things like that. They don't manage the operating system itself. That is down to you still. So again, there is that constant or that similarity between the two. Um, with AVD, as we said, you look after the whole infrastructure from AVD configuration um, to the spinning up the virtual machines. So there is quite a bit more overhead on from the infrastructure perspective, but it depends on how much it changes as well. Because if you're only adding new virtual machines or rebuilding them, potentially that's not too much effort. Like if you've got like we said, if you've got um, teams that are used to managing virtual machines in Azure, it's not going to be too much, dissimilar to that. As well as if you're managing endpoints with Intune anyway, that's just it's the same sort of thing. So there's that slight difference, but some of that can be some of that can be taken away from you. You know, instead of potentially Microsoft doing it, you could get a partner in to help manage that environment for you. You know, that happens with Citrix as well today, or Citrix or other, RDS technologies that an organization comes in and helps deploy and manage it. It's day to day running, so it doesn't necessarily mean you have to have the skills. It's just obviously you got to include that. The great thing around both of them really is that because it's all in Azure, you don't have to buy hardware up front when it's physical, when it's on premise. You haven't got to predict what your sizing is at that point. Really, it's all flexible generally.
Yeah, because we're not comparing here, the cost of a laptop to an AVD, really. Well, we are, but we're not really, because if you were to roll your own RDS, you've got to buy server infrastructure
Yeah.
to do that, and then potentially licensing on top of that, especially if you're talking like a
Well,
Citrix, and
Citrix
even, yeah,
RDS. Yeah.
an RDS. Like there's those things to think about, as well. So yeah, I think the Windows 365 sort of frames it in a way that it seems like a laptop
Yeah.
specification, doesn't it, or a desktop specification? But actually, when you're doing that comparison, it's against server infrastructure to Windows 365, as well.
Yeah. I mean the Windows 365 is um, marketed or positioned as a cloud PC for users, which is what it is. And that's you can get that with AVD as well. Um, but yeah, again, overheads. Potentially you still might have to manage your networking with it, and things like that. And uh, again, like I was saying with AVD, yes, you could get someone else in. Potentially, if you're deploying, your infrastructure as code, it can be terraformed. It can be ARM template. It can be Bicep. You can do that to simplify. If you've got a template of a type of machine that if you need to spin a new one up, you can. It's not. It's some of it is,
Did you just use the word simplify and terraform bicep and
wow,
arm
I
all in
was
the
just about
same?
to say that, the
No,
way that
no, I'm only
we've been
making
doing
it. I'm
it
only joking.
is,
Yeah.
yeah, we if you think about, well, it's a good point that when we did our Terraform for our stuff, there was quite a lot of steps that we'd have to rinse and repeat a lot, and now
uh,
we can spin up an AVD environment with, multiple AVD environments within sort of 20 minutes now.
yeah, the simplest yeah, the simplicity comes from the orchestration at scale, doesn't
Yeah.
it? And the repeatability. You make that investment in infrastructure as code, and yes, it is definitely slower than clicking buttons in the portal. I completely, 100%. But once it is created, it is repeatable. In if you want to spin up new environments, you're effectively, duplicating what you're creating. Carbon copying potentially. Infrastructure. Things like disaster recovery and things like that. There's lots of good mitigations with infrastructure as code as well. Um, One thing I just wanted to ask is there a consideration for if I let's say I had 20 users, let's say, and they were pretty lightweight users. And let's say I would buy on the Windows 365 side, I'd buy 20 SKUs for those users for cloud PCs. But on the AVD side, I could potentially spread those 20 users across, let's say, 4 hosts, right? Is there a if I'm go if my workload is multi-session compatible, could I potentially reduce the amount of like patching and management of the boxes because I've only got 4 versus 20? Now, how does that work from a day-to-day, IT management perspective?
Yeah, that's probably a good scenario actually. That, yeah, if you've got users that in Windows 365, you'd have to give them, individual machines, which, would be what you do. Give them a desktop, a laptop anyway, potentially. If they were joining the organization. But if they've got their own equipment, or they've got some lightweight equipment, maybe some thin terminals, etc., that you're pushing out to them to save some costs from hardware perspective, um, then, yeah, from a patching perspective in Windows 365, you'd have to patch, you'd have to patch and manage 20 machines. And you're right with AVD, potentially you could get that down to 4 machines. It's quite different when you could do it at scale, because potentially you could have, um, say you've got, your organization as a team in finance, say, and it's got 300 users in it. And you've got, they've all got their own machines, say, and you want to give them a, secure access to a cloud PC. So yeah, that'd be 400 machines for each user in Windows 365. Or potentially, if they're just using Excel, Word, things like that, it might only be 10 machines, 15 maybe. Depends on the size of the VMs and things like that, and their actual workload. You're right. But then that means you only got to patch 15 machines. Now there is potential, um, risk the other way, in that if you patch one of those machines, you could potentially take 1/15 of those users out, because it may patch incorrectly, where you patch once, you only take one user out. It's a thing to consider. You may want, maybe an extra machine in there so that you can, you've got one spare to patch with, kind of thing. But
Yeah, because these users, if it's multi-session, they're all going to roam, aren't they, with roaming profiles? Right, that's how you would. They
Roam with Roam
could.
profiles or FS Logics, yeah, yeah. But
Yeah. Okay.
equivalent,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. Yeah. FS Logics. Um. So really, as long as you've got the spare capacity, so like if you've got a host pool, in theory, you could add another host to that host pool for not for capacity, but for this, business continuity requirement, right? You would pay your ongoing disk cost, and you've got to patch it, I suppose. But like you say, because I kind of see that so there's a mitigation strategy for that, but I do
Yeah.
get that, one box is maybe shared by 5 people, and like you say, if something screwy goes on with that box, you could have an issue. But the other side to that is that if you were to rebuild that box, because all of those profiles are like remote profiles, then as long as the box is rebuilt and up, they will just be able to log back in and they will have the same experience.
Hmm.
Whereas I would kind of see it the other way with Windows 365 is that, okay, your radius for disruption is lower because it's just one like
User.
user.
Yeah.
But on the flip side is that user can't then jump to another box, can they?
No,
It's
because they have to
that
wait for their machine to be reprovisioned. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So, and their profile on Windows 365 is local.
Local.
If I
Yeah.
right, so
Yeah. Well,
any
with the exception of their, if we're using um, OneDrive to do the
true,
known folder
yes,
redirection,
yeah.
but yeah, there will be preferences in that if
Oh yeah, all the important stuff, not just your Word
or
documents that
software
are
installed. Yeah, because they might
yeah, yeah,
have
yeah,
had
yeah.
custom.
Custom configuration, yeah, yeah, and all of that sort of stuff. Okay, interesting. Yeah, I think that's just worth talking about because that is quite a key difference in terms of at a large scale how you manage those users, right? For smaller businesses, local profiles, rebuild it if you need to, maybe less disruption, but larger, more complex, potential workloads may require that level of, you know, uh, business continuity in the event that something like that happens. Because
Yeah,
we know how relatively
definitely.
easy it is to bring up another AVD host, right? Even if you had to
Yeah,
do it manually in the portal.
it might be that you build your capacity so that you can lose one in
Oh,
and
without a doubt,
the
yeah,
other
yeah,
machines can take it,
yeah,
sort of thing. Yeah, other hosts. So at least then you've got that. You know, when there's no when there's no issues when the patching's not taking place, they've all got extra capacity. And then when something goes wrong with one host, there's capacity for the others to
yeah, because
take it whilst you fix it.
we're talking about, let's say we go from 20 users to 4 hosts as just a random example, adding hosts 5 or 6 is only your disk cost going forward because in theory on a normal day-to-day basis you're not going to boot them anyway, right? They're going to be
Yeah, true.
deallocated ready for you to go. You do have to think about whether there's actually capacity to bring them up at that point, but that's another conversation I suppose as well. But you're still going from 20 to 6. You're still halving, or
Mm.
way over halving. You know, 60% reduction in the amount of hosts that you've got to patch. That seems like it could save a lot of time. For teams.
Yeah, definitely. Especially if you do have a large workforce that can use multi-session. Maybe you have that. Maybe that's why you've gone down an RDS solution generally anyway. And you can, like I said, if you may already have Citrix, things like that, it might be stores that are connecting in, or the manufacturing, you know, well, factories and things like that, connecting in, where they don't, they might not have capacity to actually, have machines
Yeah,
physically,
exactly.
because again, both technologies can, you can access them from pretty much any device anyway. So that's a bonus. It can be on their tablets or whatever to access Outlook, things like that.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, Alan, is there any other bits? I'm out of questions. I think you've covered the differences, and I think the key takeaway for me is that they're very similar tools, and it's not which is better, it's which is right for you, and it could even be a combination of the two. That's what it feels like to me.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. It's that it's not one's better than the other. It's does it fit your scenario? Does it meet your need? And do you need both? I see a lot of organizations using both where they need remote machines, because there are, don't get me wrong, if if one makes sense than the other, that's absolutely fine. It's not a thing, but we're seeing in our organizations, even within ours, we're seeing a combination. So yeah.
Okay, cool. Thank you very much for that, Alan. That was a great overview. So, in comparison, so thank you very much for that. What's our next episode going to be about?
Oh, well, our next episode is about the podcast. It's our season finale. So it's our yes, that's episode 21. It's the end of this season.
Yeah,
So we can have a break to build some content or get some content and start again in what, a couple of, well, 2 or 3 or 4 weeks coming when we say we're going to start. We'll have to work that out.
yeah,
But yeah, so it's just a recap really about what we've done, what we've changed, what we might plan to do for season 4. Can't
yeah.
believe we're on season 4. Well, looking to even think about season 4.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, we're good. Yeah, we'll take a short break in between the seasons, like Alan said, to rest up. Come back with some good ideas for the podcast going forward. And yeah, next week we'll just have a wrap up, quite a light-hearted session of just reviewing and sort of going through what we've learned over the past 20 20 weeks. I call it 20 weeks. Yeah, it's crazy. Cool. So if you've enjoyed this episode, please do consider subscribing if you'd like to listen to more of this sort of content in the future. We have many more topics that we'd like to cover, and your listens and support is what will continue to fuel the podcast going forward.
We also have the ability for you to give some feedback. Did you enjoy this episode? Disagree with our thoughts? Or have I missed something out? Um, Please use the form in our show notes to take us to our site to leave us a message. We've also got the ability to um, do a voice message in the bottom right corner of our site. So check it out and yeah, send us a message.
Perfect. Thanks very much, Alan, and we'll catch you all next week. Thanks.
Yep. Thanks, everyone. Speak soon. Bye.